All right, hello everyone. I hope you're doing super duper well today. Today we have a very special session. The session is going to be moderated by Rafif, one of my good friends. Rafif is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful person. We've created a bunch of games together. She's a BAFTA winner, so she can tell you a ton about this stuff and what she's done in the game design narrative space. The session is about narrative, so this is why today we have Jenna Yao from Co-op and Devan from Crytek. They're both, again, really good friends of mine. We've met a bunch of times. Jenna's attendance rate at the Gaming Academy is at 100%, which is amazing. And they've been around for quite a while, so they do have a lot to share. And you can also watch the previous sessions from Jenna to kind of see how they've been evolving over time. I met Devon through Jenna actually, and Devon works at Crytek. For those of you that don't know, the Cry in Crytek stands for Far Cry, kind of. Well, not really, but Devon will explain it basically for you. So as we mentioned before, this talk will be about narrative design, and if you all have any questions whatsoever, post them in the chat, just have fun basically. So yeah, Rafif, if you'd like to introduce yourself and then take it away for Devon and Jenna, it's all yours.
Sure. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Rafif Clinton. I'm a Saudi game developer. I mostly do game and narrative design as well as production. I've won a student BAFTA for my final year project game during my master's degree called Aerospace Xavier's Love Solutions. And recently, the game I produced, There Was a Home, also won a student BAFTA this year, like a couple of weeks ago, which is really cool because that means there's two Saudi female students who won in a row, which is always great. Jenna, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm a narrative designer based in the US. I grew up around Washington, D.C., and then moved to Washington State, which doesn't matter to anybody who doesn't know US geography, but I'm basically 3 hours behind now. I went to art school and then came out of it writing and doing game design and did a thesis game that was the longest form written fiction piece I've ever done, and then ended up just getting hired for writing continuously. And now I'm based at Co-op, which is a worker-owned studio in Montreal. Uh, Most recently, we came out with Goodbye Volcano High, which won a bunch of awards, and Ridiculous Fishing EX for Apple Arcade, which we're hoping will also win a bunch of awards. Currently, we're working on something unannounced. And yeah, Devin.
Hi, I'm Devan. I'm currently a senior narrative designer at Crytek. Like Ash said, that's the company that made the first Far Cry and the Crisis series, which are now quite old. If you know the meme, Can It Run Crisis? I want to know what time machine you jumped in, because I think I'm the oldest person here, like by far. So yeah, games is my third career. I studied writing in school. I then went to Japan as an English teacher, and when I came back, I was doing editing, and I found a job for writing like a Japanese romance sim for a company that had just opened up a US division. And I thought, wouldn't this be very silly? And I had a friend grab me and say, you have to do it, for the Vine or whatever. So I did. I ended up getting the job. And since then, I've been writing for games. So I've worked in the indie, mobile, and AAA spaces.
I was actually a fan of the mobile game app that Devin wrote for, and I was a fan of Devin's work specifically before we were friends.
You're very sweet. Jenna and I are also from the same area. So Jenna
Yeah.
was the first and for a long time the only game developer I'd been able to meet up with in real time and go get coffee and fancy desserts.
Yeah. I actually was recently traveling to Europe with my family, and I had a layover long enough in Frankfurt that we were able to meet up in person again for the first time in a few years, which was really nice.
It's always really nice to have a game development community nearby to understand the struggles.
Yeah, there wasn't
So
really
yeah,
much of a community in DC, so it was
No.
extra surprising to find Devin.
that is surprising. I wasn't expecting there to not be a community in DC. It feels like there will be a community in every big city in the US, so good to know. So yeah, can you tell me more about how you got into game development? Jen, you can go ahead.
Sure. So I went to an art school in Baltimore, which is a little bit further north of Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. And I originally went for illustration, but went with the intention of wanting to be a concept artist for game design because I really liked Transistor by Supergiant Games, which came out when I was a freshman in high school, and I was like, I want to do that. Um, and while I was at art school, I still really like doing illustration and making art, but I was taking game design classes alongside my illustration classes and found them to be way more emotionally fulfilling for me because I like the collaborative element compared to the more competitive environment of illustration. And I also just found a lot of personal fulfillment in uh, systems design and telling stories through gameplay as opposed to having to present a story entirely on my own and hoping the audience will pick up what I put down. Um, so I didn't really know what I wanted from games for a few years, and then by the end of my time in college, the pandemic had started, so I was totally online. But I also had learned what game design was, or narrative design was. I'm sorry, and was like, oh yeah, that's exactly it. I don't consider myself a writer, but I like telling stories, and I don't consider myself a game designer, but I like messing with mechanics. So this seems like the perfect happy place. And so it was. And then in terms of how I got into games professionally, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in 2020, when there was the port explosion in Beirut, I was contacted by a Lebanese American YouTuber who was interested in doing a fundraiser that unfortunately never came to fruition, but he was hiring Lebanese illustrators based in the US to help to work with him. And I and another person ended up collaborating together, and that person is Alex, who's the game director for a game called Spirit Swap that had a successful Kickstarter campaign a few years ago and is coming out any day now. But after I worked with them on the fundraiser, they hit me up a few months later and were like, "Hey, do you want to do some concept art for my game?" And I said yes, and then did the art test, and then it was all downhill from there.
What about you, Devan?
Yeah, I guess the longer version is I studied writing and English. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I knew that it was a very oversaturated field, especially in games. You don't make money doing this. I still don't make money doing this, but I thought I would be more practical with it. I would go into teaching and editing, and more not lucrative, but maybe more stable fields, until this random job ad popped up for writing for a romance game. And it was something I had never considered, but I was in a real rut. I was very unhappy at my editing job. It was for an architectural firm, and they did a lot of big fancy projects, but I wasn't an architect. So there was no room for me to ever be promoted or to even make a lateral move until I went back to school. And in the US, that's so many thousands of dollars. And so yeah, this romance game job ad came along, and I was looking at the requirements, and I thought, well, what I'm doing right now for fun is writing fan fiction, and I think I could take all of those skills and just apply them here. Like, a lot of fan fiction is that kind of deep interpersonal drama and romance. So I took an old fan fiction for a video game I played when I was like 14, and I changed all the names, and I turned that in as my writing sample, and then I get a call, and they're like, "We would like to hire you, please." So always write fan fiction is the first lesson. Um, and yeah, from there it kind of spiraled. I worked part-time on gigs. It wasn't enough money to live off of for quite a while. And then I just through networking and through recommendations, I did a gig, somebody else knew somebody who needed a writer to do it fast, so on and so forth. I ended up accumulating so many of them that I was able to quit my full-time job and do game writing more than full-time. I had to work a lot of hours to make the same amount of money, so I don't really recommend that route, but it is the one I did. And yeah, the projects have continued to come. I've been very, very fortunate because the industry is in kind of a rocky place right now.
Yeah, it's always interesting talking to different people and seeing how their pipeline into games is. I don't know a lot of people who's done illustrations first and then got into like narrative or game design, so that's a very interesting way. Writing, it's really funny because I heard a lot of jokes about how every fan fiction writer is now a game narrative designer or writer. So that that is very funny to me. Yeah, for myself, I didn't know I can make a career out of making games for the most part. I went like I did a bachelor's in computer science and during my bachelor, I took a course on game development, and surprisingly, I got introduced into Unity, and somehow I really enjoyed it. So I started trying to pursue that, but then there wasn't a lot of studios in Saudi at the time. So I worked with a studio that uses Unity and Unreal, just like by proxy, trying to get some experience. And then I did a master's in game design and development, and that's kind of what got me a bit more uh, directly into game, I would say. Um, but yeah, so I think the next question, which a lot of people don't really, have a very solid idea for, is what is narrative design, or what do you think is narrative design to you? Devan, do you want to take this one first?
Yes. What isn't narrative design? This is something I hit people with all of the time because I think we take it for granted as human beings how much our brains are geared toward finding patterns and making stories and dealing with cause and effect. Like more than any other creature on this earth, this is psychologically how we're wired. Like the person in front of you at the grocery store, if you have ever looked into what they're buying and come up with an idea of who they are, that's narrative design. If you go on a hike and the different scenes you see unfolding before you, that's narrative design. When you ask somebody, how was your day? And you see them think about what parts of it they're going to tell you about, like what they think is relevant, that's narrative design. Like literally everything in the entire world is story because of how we process. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to get really fun with it. I love to see other narrative designers like on what was left of Twitter giving their examples. You know, a music video is narrative design and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
For me, it's reality TV.
Yes.
That's also me justifying to myself how much reality TV I watch. Um, the way that I usually explain narrative design to my parents who don't know anything about video games is that I'm like, I do the writing for games sometimes, but mostly I'm figuring out how the story is delivered to the player. Even in a game that doesn't have a lot of writing, there's still a story there, and I'm kind of helping direct the player through their narrative experience in that game. Like Devin said, it's basically like there's story everywhere, but the design of it is something that we are specialized in kind of looking for and predicting and making it so that we can try to predict how the player will move through that space in our designed worlds and kind of guiding them along the experiences that we hope them to have and seeing what happens because no matter what you do, uh, players are always going to hit you with something unexpected or take something away that you didn't really think you were putting in. So for narrative design, it's a lot of hard work of like making things flow together, and then the rest of it is completely in the hands of the player and just really hoping that they come away with a coherent story.
Yeah. But there are a lot of strategies that you can do to guide players through the experience you hope that they'll have while also maintaining their agency. That's really delicate, and that's a lot of narrative design as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think kind of like narrative design is figuring out how to direct the player properly throughout your story. So just if you don't want them to go there, you need to treat them as an adult and like give them a proper reason why to not go there and stuff like that, which is I think it's a lot trickier than people expect, and they always conflate it with writing, which segues very well into our next question. Is it the same as storytelling?
I don't see why it wouldn't be. I feel like it's a subset of storytelling skills. I think storytelling can encompass a lot more than just a design narrative, but it definitely like they're holding hands. Like do not separate them.
Yeah. I guess the reason everything can be narrative design is also because everything can be storytelling.
Definitely. Even like the placement of a single rock can be storytelling if you play your chords right.
Yeah, environmental
Um,
storytelling, quite
yeah,
literally.
Yeah.
yeah. So what are some of the things that that inspire you in your work, whether it's other games, books, fan fiction? That works as well.
Let's see, other games for sure. I love to look at different dialogue systems, especially because everyone's got a little bit of different flavor over where they want that player agency to come in? Like, do you get to choose what your player says, or do you just get to choose the vibe of what they say? Or is there a hidden system behind the scenes of you can only talk like Elden Ring styles if you're in the right place at the right time and you've done the right thing and you'll never know? Yeah, I get a lot of inspiration from that.
I feel like ever since I started working in games and making them, I started playing them significantly less, or I just started playing games that have absolutely nothing to do with my job. So like for the longest time while I was working on games, the game that I played the most was Tetris, which you'd be hard pressed to really point the narrative design out in that game. So I can't say that other games inspire me nearly as much for narrative design so much as actually trying to like branch out from them does. I've been getting more into poetry lately because I've found like the way that a lot of poets play with like linear, non-linear structure and like how they deliver their poems on a page. Like I once read a poem where this person had basically done uh like a 3-column, 3-row table for their poem. Like they actually had like the Google Sheets like spreadsheet printed on the page to
A
deliver
game
their
dev
poem.
poem.
And I was just like, that's so cool. Like that's narrative design to me. But just like thinking about ways to tell stories in methods that aren't necessarily like the 3-act structure or like the exact like screenwriting like beating the story method has always been really exciting to me, and I've been really trying to get more into written works that play with that structure. And then I also, like I said earlier, I do watch a lot of reality TV, which I think is kind of a masterclass in narrative design because it's all about delivering a real narrative but within the trappings of usually a game of some kind if it's a reality competition show, but then also like depending on the production of the show, there's like usually a very deft hand in editing things so that you start to root for certain characters and like contestants in the show without even realizing it. Like you think you're getting to see everybody equally, but you're really not. Like you're seeing hand-picked narratives from all the contestants that the editors really want you to hone in on because they think it's what's going to get attention, and they're usually right. Um, and I think there's just a lot to learn from like how they create essentially conflict engines in the creation of reality TV sets and like competition structures where they intentionally are trying to put these players against each other and see what stories come out of them. And one of my favorite examples of this is that Netflix show The Circle, because in the first season, it was their like first attempt ever doing it. They tried to really pit people against each other but didn't know how to. So by the end of the game, there's a really strong core of 5 people that just really liked each other and like barely sabotaged each other. Like the reason that they all made it to the end from the beginning is because they hit it off right away and then just like held tight to each other. And every subsequent season of The Circle since has been basically making sure that that can never happen again. And it's really interesting to see the reactive game design emerge from the new seasons where they try to like make sure each season is something new and interesting while still familiar enough to not completely lose viewers.
I think another aspect of this is pro sports as
Yeah.
well. It's
Yes.
like the ultimate procedural generation, right? Where you have all these pieces and you don't know who's going to win or who's going to perform. And then just listening to the newscasters as the season goes on and the kind of narratives that they're making as they talk about, you get these underdog stories or these like, oh my gosh, the Patriots, American football, like everybody hates them so much because they won too many times. Like I love to see how sports goes throughout the
Yeah.
run.
I mean, the Olympics right now is a huge
Yeah.
example of that. Like, there's some front runners in terms of like people that we're paying extra attention to in the US. Like, I don't even think he's raced yet, but Noah Lyles, the American runner who like whipped out a Yu-Gi-Oh card before qualifying. Like, my friends and I are like writing down his like competition schedule because we're like, we gotta see if he does this again. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of inspiration for narrative design in everything.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, the poetry one is actually very interesting because if you're familiar with Arabic poetry, they used to have like a certain structure in like the pre-Islamic era where you need to start a poem regardless of what your topic is, you need to start a poem with certain rules of, oh, you need to basically mourn your old home or mourn your old lover, and you need at some point to also talk about like your horse and how mighty and strong your horse is. So it's very interesting because you do kind of have like a weird set of rules that everyone decided to follow for some reason,
Yeah,
but it
there's like
was
genre
still very
conventions.
strong storytelling.
I love
Yeah.
this
Yeah, that's
overlap
really
with
cool.
country music as well. Like, it's got to have a horse, it's got to have a dog, it's got to have an ex-wife, and it's got to have a train. Like,
And maybe fishing.
maybe fishing.
Maybe.
So moving away a bit from like storytelling specifically, but what is it like to work in your studio, in your respective studios?
Devin, do you want to go first for this?
Sure. Yeah, it's almost hard to say because every studio, in my experience, has been so different. And also, let's see, I started in freelance, so most freelancers are remote contractors in the industry in general. And then, of course, the pandemic. So this is actually my first studio experience that's like in a studio, and I had to relocate to Germany for it. So I enjoy the studio. I really like my coworkers. I like to be in with my headset and, my like, they put fresh fruit out and that's nice. Like, I'm in with my banana and my coffee and my meeting with my cool headset and my monitors. But like, I also enjoy that a lot of studios are still doing hybrid. And yeah, work in the studio is a lot of, I don't know if it's just Crytek or if game developers in general prefer later schedules, if it's like a tech industry thing, but core hours tend to start a little later and go a little later. So working in the morning is usually very quiet and peaceful for me. That's when I do like my writing and my work that I need to just be alone for. And then afternoons are a lot of meetings and things. What about you, Jenna?
Well, I don't relate to what you said about starting late just because I made the silly decision to move to the West Coast after starting my job at Co-op. So Co-op is entirely remote, but we do have a physical office in Montreal. But that is back on the east side of America. Or I'm sorry, North America to specify, it's in Canada. So it's a little bit of a weird situation for me because I'm working for an international company effectively. And then I also am working 3 hours behind everybody else. So stand up for everybody on Mondays is 10:30 a.m., but for me it's 7:30, and I have sleep issues as it is. So I don't super enjoy that. But everything else about the job is kind of worth it for me because co-op is indie, but we've been around for a very long time, and we've effectively been like democratically run since its conception. We've been around for 12 years now, and I've been working here for about 2.5 of them. And yeah, it's really nice. I joined kind of at the time of a trash fire because I joined late in development for Goodbye Volcano High, and my job was specifically to get it over the finish line. So for the first like year and a half I was there, it was very stressful and very much like working with a lot of people that are already done with this project right as I'm starting with it. But ever since we've gotten that game out the door and out of our hands, it's been really nice. I work with a lot of multidisciplinary people who like you were saying earlier, it's really unusual for a lot of to go from illustration to narrative design. Um, there's a lot of people that I work with that have just utterly crazy second lives that they lived before entering games, and like just all sorts of interesting skill sets. So people really get to kind of switch between whatever they're interested in doing and what suits the project best. Um, and it's really nice. I really do wish that I could work in person, but I also don't want to deal with immigration, so I'm fine staying in the US for now. I am planning on going to Montreal later this fall for a writer's summit, which is going to be really exciting. Oh, that's the other thing. My studio is very small, especially compared to Devan's. So up until last September, I was the only narrative person there, like entirely. And now there's 2 more people, which is a 300% increase. 200% increase. I don't do math, I write. But it is wildly different to be the only person that's advocating for story in all the big team meetings to being one of three, to being one of, I don't even know how many you are, Devan.
We are 5. But the fun thing about bigger companies is that other things scale as well. So sometimes 5 is not a lot, and sometimes it's a
Yeah.
ton, but
It sounds like a ton to me, but it is, but I feel like that's actually kind of small for AAA. Uh-oh, I said
Yeah.
something.
It's okay. At least Jenna, you do have like the body power to be like, hey, this is what we want. This is the story we want to enforce.
Yeah,
So there's at least more power there.
it's I mean, sometimes when games are really late into production and they need things to cut for scale so things get shipped, narrative is usually the first team that's asked to cut back. And sometimes that happens
Yep.
even when you're working on a story focused game that's whole selling point is that it's a narrative experience. And sometimes it just gives you a lot of gray hairs at 23.
it's very
But
hard to juggle because games are expensive to make, like, period. Even small
very,
games now, just drastically more expensive than they were 10 years ago. And narrative is often the cheapest thing to cut because it's words, it's not art or implementation or coding. And those are usually the quickest to get in and out of the engine, in my experience. I don't know about you, Jenna. Not that it's cheap, it's still expensive to cut, but
we've been working with tools that make it the cheapest to get in and out of the engine.
yeah.
But like one of the things that I learned really quickly is like when I was just writing like just churning out quick scenes and like scene directions for them and being like, okay, like these two characters high five or something, I would get like desperate pleas from storyboarders and animators being like, please don't have characters touch each other right now. We can't afford it. And I'm like, okay.
Who did that famous tweet that was like, I wrote in the script that a character picks up a glass of water and realized I sent shockwaves through 8 departments? Like,
That's exactly it. Like, uh, animation is incredibly expensive. And with writing for like movies and film, it's like if you're doing live action, it's like you can tell an actor to pick up a glass, and it's like no problem. You want a game character to pick up a glass? No, it's like you've unleashed the plagues upon Egypt. Like it's bad. Um, so you learn, even though it is like narrative is very flexible. At the same time, we have to kind of bend unwillingly around a lot of constraints for other departments just because we don't want any holes in the game. Um, so a lot of times narrative kind of like suffers the most cuts because everything else has to be functional and narrative uh, the further away narrative is from the rest of the departments, the more obvious the gap is.
Oh, there's yeah, okay. Yeah, definitely. I think we all can complain for hours about how narrative is usually gets cut like yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you don't
Um,
have to get ready if you stay ready, so be ready to get your stuff cut whenever, I guess.
I've tried that before as well. It still didn't work. Like I made a plan with stretch levels, but then we like even the core levels were kind of but yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's smart
cutting
though.
stuff
It's good
very fun.
practice. Yeah, no, at some point after I'd already like what I thought I'd already whittled the story of Goodbye Volcano High down to the bone as much as I could, they were asking me for more cuts, and I was like, if you ask me to cut more, we're not going to have a coherent story, like at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
you never know
Um,
what's going to go wrong during game development, though.
Absolutely. So our next question is, how can you create different worlds and characters without having them all sound similar? I think this is definitely a thing a lot of young creators might struggle with when it comes to narrative. Devan, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess I have not had this problem personally. There are many other problems that I have and flaws with my writing that I have had to overcome and still overcome. But I think when you really look at that advice of like write what you know, it's how many people in this world do you know? And aren't they all different, very different? And can't you tell them apart? And how many places have you been to? And don't they all have different vibes and things about them and you use them for different things? And yeah, I don't know. I think that part comes naturally. But for example, when you're trying to design a cast of characters and each one needs to be unique in a special way, in that case, it is useful to what I always do is start with theme. So, like, what is the point of the story I'm trying to tell? And then what kinds of characters reflect different aspects of this story? So if there's a if there's a conflict and I want it to be complicated, I need people on all sides and of all opinions. If it's like a slice of life or a romance, I need characters that all have something very lovable about them, but a different personality type, right? Um, and it's okay to go through multiple iterations as well, to come up with a cast of 5 people, and then be like, number 4 and number 5, I don't know what number 5 is adding or whatever, and come up with someone else.
Yeah, I think that's actually
Yeah,
very
definitely.
important to remember what you said about theme, Devin, because something that I kind of really want to stress to people writing in games is that characters can sound realistic, but it's also okay if they sound like characters in a video game. What's more important is the purpose that they serve in the story, because just like your setting and your plot points and all that stuff, your characters aren't like human beings that you're subjecting to your story. They are also parts of the story that can be responsible for events themselves and play a part in delivering your message. And I think it's really important that, like, I don't know, there's kind of like a industry cultural wide uh, preoccupation with realism as the height of art. And I don't think that's true at all. And a lot of stories critiques that are like, if I was in this situation, I wouldn't do this. It's like, okay, well, you're not it. That yes, you're right, because you're not in a story, you're in real life. Like what matters most is, like Devin said, like ensuring that the aspects of your story that need balance are delivered through like your characters, and like that they fulfill what's necessary for the genre to be able to tell your story.
It's also really important
Definitely.
to stylize to hop. Oh, sorry, Rafi.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. I was just agreeing with you. So
Oh yeah,
go ahead.
me too. Yeah. I mean, Jenna can speak to this better as an actual artist, but like animation is always the example I come back to. When you animate movement, it's not realistic movement at all. There are all kinds of like, if you take still shots of Looney Tunes cartoons, they're stretched into all these crazy shapes.
Smears.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
smears and blurs. And that's, you can kind of think of characterization the same way because they need to feel real, but it's really important that they are not exact copies. Because if I wanted to talk to a real person, I would go outside and do it. But a stylized character can give you more about this world, about this character, about this point you're trying to make in ways that can be the same level of immersion as watching a cartoon or an animated feature and feeling kind of mesmerized by that.
You also have to be so
Um,
efficient with scope, like with the cuts that we were just talking about in mind. You have to be so efficient with every line of dialogue that makes it to the end. You have to make all of them count. Like, because like when you're texting someone or just like having a conversation, like there's probably going to be like a lot of like kind of like mindless pleasantries, but like a conversation in a cutscene is expensive. So you have to make every line of dialogue like ensure, like you can't just be like have them talk about the weather in a cutscene unless it's absolutely imperative that they do because the weather is going to play a role. Like it's really essential that you consider the maximum efficiency to both convey character, convey story information, and keep the plot moving.
Definitely. The point about stylization also reminds me of a talk I attended once for the game Overboard, where they were talking about how cliches and stereotypes aren't necessarily bad. Like you can lean into them as long as you make it respectful. Like just don't lean into the bad stereotypes or the bad cliches of different characters, because that's it's kind of like a sure way to make sure that people understand the character, basically, because it seems a lot more familiar than if it's something that has to be completely groundbreaking. Yeah. So our next question is, do you have any tips for people who are starting out or who are trying to get a job in narrative or as a narrative designer?
Try winning the lottery instead. I don't know. No, I'm sorry, that's a little spicy. So getting a job in games as any discipline is incredibly difficult right now. It's incredibly luck based. Like both Devin and I had very different routes to getting employed. And this is true for basically everybody I work with and everybody I'm ever going to work with, is that it's not even just being in the right place at the right time. It is like 10,000 other factors of luck. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody, but I do want people to keep their expectations in check, that if they want to get hired at an existing studio, it's going to take a lot of luck. If you're trying to, if you're doing narrative design and like storytelling in games for your own creative purposes, finding funding, not something I'm as experienced with personally, still pretty tough, but it's still possible to like have your creative practice be narrative design without needing to necessarily be employed for it. In which case that's a slightly different conversation of like starting out.
Yeah, it's rough. There have always been, like, realistically, more job seekers than there have been jobs in this industry. Same goes for industry like TV and film. Um, and it does come down to, I think it's really important to, if you want to try, because everyone here deserves to try, um, manage expectations, like Jenna said, and just remember that, especially now where there are like fewer jobs than ever because of whatever economic cycle we're in that everyone is pretending is not happening. Um, you can't let the job you have or don't have equate to your personal worth or your level of skill. Like, I think it's good to surround yourself with peers and with people who like to create as well, and to just be working with them, doing projects with them, getting opinions from people you trust about what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, so many people who are qualified and overqualified for positions will apply and not get it. And it really does come down to luck. Like Jenna said, it comes down to a culture fit or a vibe check, even. Um, Once I got a job because I made a game about a sloth and the creative director is obsessed with sloths. I am not kidding. That is a real thing that happened. Um, so, and I know a lot of people, myself included, it's really difficult to get rejection after rejection and not let that impact what you feel like you deserve or your skill level. But it's important to know that that's normal, and even people who find a place dealt with rejection over and over and over and over. So I think a matter of resilience is important, and uh, yeah, expectation as well.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I've
definitely.
been
No, go ahead.
I've been involved with the hiring of another narrative designer for my studio, and to illustrate the selection process, we had 150 applicants. We narrowed it down to 20 people we were maybe interested in. From there, 4 people we wanted to interview. We interviewed 3 and hired 1. So, and that was for a senior narrative design position. So imagine that, and then imagine that exponentially harder for the lower barrier to entry jobs. Like entry level is incredibly competitive. But like Devin said, like you really need to surround yourself with creative people. And I think like if you're trying to get into games just because it's something to do, I really suggest you really need a creative drive. Like you have to really enjoy making things for the sake of making things, because otherwise the industry is just gonna like break your heart. I mean, it'll break your heart anyway, but um it's still it's easier to keep yourself afloat when you find fulfillment in doing something just for yourself, even while employment is a little bit harder.
This
Yeah,
advice is
definitely. Like the landscape. Sorry.
no, you go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the landscape right now is very volatile, and it can seem very daunting to even try and find a job, especially for writing a narrative. It feels like uh, there is no fish in the sea. It's just one fish that you need to try and catch.
Yeah,
So
kind
it
of.
definitely feels, yeah, it definitely feels a lot harder. But I think the point you've mentioned, Devin, about how that is not a direct reflection of applicant skills or anything like that. That's definitely something to always try and remember, because also like the rut we're going through right now isn't something normal, isn't something that is the average of the industry. Um, and I think it definitely takes a lot more soul out of everyone to try and stay motivated. Um, but yeah, how do you feel about people, for example, doing smaller projects or using text-based storytelling just to kind of put some projects out there to kind of build their skills? Is there anything you can recommend? Maybe some resources?
Yeah, I'd say it's basically a requirement because this is a kind of messed up ecosystem where the junior roles barely exist. And so you kind of have to onboard yourself on that and show that you're a self starter and can learn it yourself. But the good news is a lot of that is completely free and you can do it in your own time or you can get a group of friends and do it. And I highly, highly recommend starting up a little portfolio for yourself that's just tiny itty bitty games that you have finished. And just the best way to learn about making games is to make them over and over. And then if you get an interview, you are able to talk about these experiments that you've done and especially the things that you finished. That's more important than anything. The stuff that you've taught yourself. And it's really not intimidating. I assume people are here because they are more writerly types. And if you're anything like me, you hate math more than anything and are worse at it than everyone you know. But the beautiful thing about a programming language is that it's a language. And so there are many different ways to code the same thing. Not all of them are the best way or the most efficient way, but it's possible. And that opens up a lot of opportunities that, like, at least shook the fear for me. So I really recommend Twine is CSS based. That's like a browser. You can make a game in a browser, and it's like, if this happens, then this happens, and it lets you make a little flowchart. It's very intuitive. Inkle is another language that's a little more complex, but it plugs in really well with game engines. So there are studios out there asking for Inkle skills.
And there's a lot of
Um,
documentation on using Inkle. I'm biased because Inkle was my favorite tool in college, and then because I'm really good with it, I got hired for it for co-op. I do own multiple physical books on tips and tricks for Inkle. Twine is a little bit more complex because there's a bunch of different possible languages, but at the same time, it's a lot more flexible.
Definitely. I think the slight trouble with Twine is being a lot more browser based, and if you clear your cache, your story is gone. I fell for that. I didn't know you shouldn't clear your cache, and I did, and I lost the story. But it's okay.
Yeah,
At least it wasn't.
there's a desktop app for Twine. I learned that lesson the hard way as well.
yes.
Yeah.
But
There's
the hard part about
also
Twine is that there's
Artisy.
no oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just mentioning also there's like this other program called Artisy that some people use
Oh,
for
Artisy
narrative.
Draft, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a apostrophe in there somewhere, but I'm not sure. The hard part about Twine as well, I would say, is that it's not middleware, which means that it isn't really meant to integrate into other game engines. Inkle is nice because you can test through your story just as an Inkle file and then also very easily import it to Unity or Unreal. But Twine, in order to bridge the gap from Twine to Unity, requires sorcery, basically. Something a little bit like Twine that has game engine integration is Yarn Spinner, which I am a very big proponent of. They've been adding a lot of really cool stuff to the new updates that kind of bridge the gap between it and Inkle in terms of how nonlinear it can get. Because the other thing to keep in mind with all of these tools is that they all are really good at very different things.
And don't let that scare you either. Again, it's okay to pick up a new tool, learn how to do one thing with it, make a little game that does that one thing. Like,
Yeah, you don't need to be
there's
an expert,
no,
but showing you have the ability to learn is pretty good.
especially because a lot of studios have their own proprietary engine or software anyway that you're going to have to learn. So if you can come up and say, "Oh yeah, I know a little bit of Inkle, a little bit of RenPy. One time I messed around with Yarn Spinner," like that's really good to hear, actually.
Yeah. No, the way
Definitely.
that co-op uses ink was wholly unlike anything I'd ever seen before. But because I had a baseline familiarity with just how to use ink in Unity in general, it made me adapting to it way easier. But yeah, just test them out, see what you like doing with them, see what you're like, learn which one does what you like better. Like Inkle is really, really good for actually if you want to get a little bit mathy and like have some whole like equations and functions and like determining probability and then having scenes based on that. And then Bitsy is flat out like a pixel game maker that is completely free in browser, and it is amazing. And I think also does have some narrative tooling integration now.
Yeah.
I think
Also,
I think
Game
people have
Maker
bridged some tools.
is
I,
Game
I don't
Maker.
I've never used Game Maker.
Me neither.
Yeah, me neither. But yeah, these are all some really wonderful resources. We're done with our questions, so we can kind of look into some of the questions that we have here in the chat. So let's start with a question from Yasmin Ahmed. She's asking, when making a narrative, how do you keep it simple and not overcomplicated?
That is a practice skill, I would say.
Start as small as possible. It is very, very easy to have a grand idea and to start to build it out and to get too crazy right away. I say start with like a skeleton of what you need. They talk about suits. They talk about the MVP all the time, the minimal viable product, the MVP and whatever. And there is a truth to it in that if you can get the easiest, simplest, cheapest version of it to work, then you can add on muscles and bones and make it pretty and fancy. And maybe it's a human, but if you want to like add another ending, then this human has 3 arms and it goes this way. So yeah, definitely start as simple as possible and scope up.
Yeah, I think something that helped me really get into the practice of writing in general, because again, like I didn't really start as a writer, I started as an artist. The way that I was able to get in without intimidating myself too much was literally just like writing a scene and treating that as the whole experience. So one of my Twine games that I made in college that is still like one of the more popular things I've published like independently, it is literally a game that happens within the span of like in fiction like an hour. Like it is mostly a conversation and an action and then the resolution and then uh very minimal branching from there. Because the other thing with like and oh, in terms of overcomplicating, remember that branching is not inherently make your story more interesting or better. Um, Sometimes branching for branching's sake is a mistake, and it can really easily balloon out of control. In order to keep your story in check and in scope and be most effective with your branching, be very deliberate about what you're doing and what you're asking the player to choose between.
Yeah. Every part of a
Definitely.
game.
There's a lot of. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's a lot of people who, as you mentioned, like try and uh, go for branching narratives or alternative endings or just multiple endings very early on, which can get absolutely very complicated. Uh, I think starting linearly is a nice way to start, and then figuring out if it's worth adding more branches or adding more endings.
Yeah. Everything about a game should be fun and it should be a treat. And part of a treat is imposing limits and making things feel special. So, like, if it branches, you have to have a reason for why. And if it has multiple endings, you have to have a reason for why. And that that often is the hammer down on my personal scope as well, if I can't answer that question.
The next question is from Sarah Abu Said. I think it kind of relates to the last point we were talking about, which is between narrative and playability, how do you balance autonomy of the player versus the storyline?
Well, playability is also the narrative, is the thing. They don't have to be separate from each other. In terms of like autonomy of the player, you can kind of play some tricks with that and gradually give them more or less autonomy over time and kind of like really play with the feeling that that gives the player. Like if you start off very limited in what they're able to do, like in a tutorial, and then like slowly let them get more and more stuff that they're like able to do, that feels really exciting for a lot of players. But at the same time, it can also be like kind of paralyzing and overpowering with indecision. Um, Let me just go back and read that question. Yeah, the autonomy of the player also refers to the autonomy of the player within the story as well. So when you're branching out the possibilities of a possible storyline, you're basically mapping possible autonomous decisions you want your player to make. In terms of like how to balance it, every project has different needs, and sometimes your project calls for more or less autonomy. I personally don't think autonomy is necessarily a major selling point in a lot of games. For some people, it is like they really want absolute freedom, and those people tend to really like sandbox games or open world games. But I find myself very overwhelmed when I play those. I really like a tight guided experience, so I tend to design games similarly. Um, but it all boils down to like the target experience you want your player to have and how you want them to feel, and then making decisions that are going to get you towards that.
Devan, do you want to add anything, or do you want us to go to the next question?
Yeah, no, agreed on all counts.
Our next question is from Umar Hamoud. He says, asking for a friend, how would you like for a developer to treat you as a narrative designer, as in the back and forth on discussions, when maybe the developer doesn't like a certain part of the story, or a certain aspect of a character being introduced? So basically having a discussion about the story and the parts of the story from a non-narrative or like a non-narrator perspective, I suppose.
I think the most diplomatic thing you can start off by doing is asking somebody why they made those decisions. Instead of just being point blank, I don't like this, be like, hey, so why did you decide to do this? Because when you hear their thought process, you might change your mind, or you can kind of very gently, in response to their thought process, being like, I see why you thought this. This is the way I've been thinking of it, and I don't think these things really match up. Um, it is a bit of a skill on both sides to be able to give critique and also receive it. And I know that it can be really disheartening to receive critique of any kind, but you really have to get used to it and get used to taking it in stride if you want to work as a writer or narrative designer or like anybody in games. Um, but it is possible to be diplomatic. And I think like approaching it with curiosity and like wanting to meet somebody where they're at, or at least understand where they're at, is I think one of the most effective things you can do.
Yeah, or always, game development is so collaborative, and it has to be. If teams don't work together well, the game's not good, and everybody wants to make a really good game. And so I think just always approaching conversations like you're on the same team and you want to build something together and you want to like I have a friend put it once as she's an editor and it's like the writer does the story and whatever, but occasionally there are mistakes. Like you're getting dressed to go out to a party and you forget a shoe. And so she's there to like find the shoe and run out the door and be like, "Hey, you forgot your shoe." Like it doesn't mean that something drastic is wrong or a battle needs to be had. It's team members trying to cover and protect each other. Um, And hopefully you will also be open to that same kind of feedback about a design.
Yeah, it takes a lot of trust to be able to give and receive, and that trust only builds over time as you get more comfortable with like that kind of critique-based space. But like Devin said, it is ultimately collaborative because nobody wants to make a bad game, and nobody wants somebody on their team to fail because you're working on it together and you're making the same product ultimately. So it's really just a question of like balancing needs and wants from all sides. And then also remembering effectively who has the final say in creative direction. Because at work, I can argue for the narrative decisions I'm making all I want, but ultimately I am going to cede to the wishes of my creative director because I trust his vision for the project. Because it is his project, he's been with it from pitch to now. Like I have to trust that his vision is going to come through, even if he's making decisions that I don't initially agree with, that might change further down the line. But again, this is in a professional context. In terms of like a one-to-one project with your peer and like a portfolio piece, I think it's really important to make sure that you guys are both getting what you want for your portfolio out of it.
Definitely. I think we all at some point struggle with kind of delivering the narrative that we want in comparison to like a creative director who might not see eye to eye. But yeah, definitely the point you've mentioned about how it's the creative director's vision at the end of the day, and you just need to make it work. So yeah, I think we're out of questions on Teams, but I'm not sure. I don't think we have any questions on Discord, or at least as far as I can see. Uh, yeah, I think we are good to go. To Jenna, Devin, do you want to add anything else that we maybe didn't brush up on?
I feel like everything that I've wanted to say to narrative designers or people wanting to get into narrative design, I've said in one of like the previous years. So every year I come to this, I'm like, I know less of what to say because I've already said it, or I know much more and I know that I was wrong before. Um, so I think I'm fresh out unless somebody has like a specific question. And then maybe if Devin says something inspiring, I'll be able to jump onto that.
All I would say is that it is difficult to study games and to do it professionally and to take something fun and that you love and make it something that's more integral to your life and like how you survive. In any artistic pursuit, that's really difficult. And so whatever it is that you need to do to keep the joy of creating and designing, do that. And remember that that's something we all do as humans and something we all love is story, whether people realize it or not. Um, and that's really great to have on a bad day. You can always tell a story for free with Twine.
You can also always play a story that somebody else has made for free with Twine.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good ones on itch.
Oh yeah, I love finding small weird stuff, but sometimes it actually makes me incredibly jealous because I feel like the smaller you work, the weirder you can get, and I'm like, I want to be weird too, but I'm stuck making a professional video game, which is a really annoying problem to have. But I do really admire people able to be experimental in the space because they don't have to worry about like profit.
Definitely. All right, so I don't think we have any other questions. Um, so yeah, thank you, Jenna and Devin, for your time today. It's wonderful having you. Uh, hopefully we'll have you again soon, maybe in the future. Yeah, have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
having us. I'm
thank you.
putting my work email